everyone. It's Megan Ramos here with my lovely co-host, Dr. Nadia Pataguana. Nadia, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Megan. How about you?
I'm doing well. Looking forward to all the nice spring weather and summer vacations. All these great things that are on the horizon. I actually think when this episode airs, because I know most of our listeners know we record these a little bit in advance, you're actually going to be on a bit of a vacation yourself. So I'm excited for you. I will live vicariously through you until you're back and I get a little bit of an escape.
Well, I'm actually one of those weird people that I've shared this with our community many times, especially when we were doing the group fast, the pre-vacation strategies. I'm one of those people that actually stresses a little too much during vacation. So I need to work on my cortisol lowering techniques before and after.
It's always good to have a couple buffer days when you get home. We were planning our trip in July this morning, actually. And my husband said, let's fly home on the Saturday. And I said, no, let's just come home on the Friday. That way we have Saturday and Sunday to just get ready because, work is going to come fast and furiously on the Monday, especially after escaping for a week. So I can hear you on the coming home part. Often coming home from a vacation can be pretty stressful and almost undo all of the benefits of a trip. But fingers crossed that you have a really lovely and cortisol reducing time during this getaway. I think so many of us after the last 2 years are just so in need for a getaway. But fingers crossed, Nadia.
I'll do my best, I promise.
All right, everyone. Well, we're here today with one of our Q&A episodes. This is where Nadia and I come together and answer your questions. We'd love to hear them. So if you have questions you'd love for us to tackle during one of these episodes, please email them in to questions@thefastingmethod.com. All right, I'm going to kick off things with our first question because this is something I'm notorious about talking about to our community members. You say not to nurse coffee that contains cream. Is it okay to nurse a cup of black coffee or hot tea without caffeine in it during your fast? So over at the Fasting Method, we talk about these caloric containing fasting fluids that people might have. So something like bone broth or a very fatty coffee or a fatty tea. And we talk about how sipping on them for hours on end. You might be one of those people that will go reheat that morning coffee 6 or 7 times before you finish it later on in the afternoon. Or the same thing with a cup of bone broth. We talk a lot about how that has a very low grade insulin stimulus. So if you're sipping on the fatty tea or coffee or the cup of broth for hours, you're constantly having this low grade production of insulin throughout your fast. And for many individuals with insulin resistance, this can be really problematic and can counteract some of the benefits of the fast. You need to think of yourselves as a big, tall glass of water, everyone. And if you've got insulin resistance, your glass is totally full. It's on the verge of overflowing if it's not already overflowing. And say someone whose cup is already overflowing all of the time would be an individual on diabetic medications or on insulin. So when we're fasting, we're essentially draining that cup of water. So we're draining your bodies of insulin. Now, if you're fasting, but you're also dropping insulin or water into the cup, it's going to continuously overflow, or you're going to be adding while you're trying to subtract, and it kind of defeats the purpose or can minimize the results. So when you're grazing on these fluids that are going to have this sort of low-grade insulin response, you're constantly dripping into that cup that you're trying to empty. And we do see this be very problematic for a lot of our individuals. So we talk about it as sort of being the equivalent to snacking on a fasting day is grazing on these caloric insulin stimulating beverages. Now, that's not that you shouldn't have them. I mean, if adding a little bit of fat to your coffee in the morning, if that gets you 24 hours of fasting afterwards, the return on investment for that fattier cup of coffee in the morning is huge. You're getting a 24-hour fast in, if not longer, because that morning cup of coffee is able to suppress your appetite. Or if that afternoon cup of broth helps ward away that 4 o'clock witching window, well, heck, have that cup of broth, because then you're getting in that fasting throughout the night and overnight. The return on investment is so beneficial. So it's not that you should squash the consumption of some of these fasting training wheels, but you actually need to think of them as sort of fasting, quote unquote, meals. You want to sit down, free from distraction, enjoy the fatty cup of tea or coffee, enjoy the cup of broth, but think of it as a meal. You want to consume it within an hour or less. And then you go on with your daily activities where you're just sort of drinking water or black coffee or herbal teas in between. So to go to this listener's question, yes, it's okay in between incidents of perhaps having to have these fasting training wheels, or even on your eating days in between meals when we're trying to get in some mini fasts between meals on our eating days. It's perfectly okay to have that black coffee, especially if you find it appetite suppressing, and to have those herbal teas. That's not a problem there, especially if they don't have caffeine in it. Or in them. Some people do have an insulin response. They have a stress response to consuming caffeine. I find it's about 50-50. 50% of the people have some caffeine, see no glucose response, appetite's completely suppressed. So whatever tea or coffee that they're having's not agitating their system. And then the other half of people will have some coffee or have some caffeinated tea, like a black tea, and they'll start to feel really hungry and they'll start to see their glucose levels creep up. So those individuals are having a bit of a stress response to the coffee or the caffeine in the tea or coffee. So for those individuals, we'll definitely recommend that they say more to decaf coffee, herbal teas without caffeine. Or for those who might be pretty sensitive to it, the caffeine, we would maybe sub out for a matcha green tea. Matcha green tea is pretty cool. It comes in a powdered form. It's Japanese green tea. I use a fancy whisk to whisk it into water. And it's got a nice fresh taste to it. But it's a very, very slow release caffeine. So it's a good substitute for individuals who are definitely coffee lovers, used to that much caffeine, and are trying to figure out a way to lessen their consumption of it and not necessarily experience the big burden of quitting caffeine cold turkey. So if you are experiencing increased appetite and high sugars after having some caffeine, you might want to switch to the matcha. And it's okay again to also quote unquote nurse that matcha throughout the fasting day if you're not adding anything to it. Nadia, any other thoughts on this subject?
Yeah, I'd like to add in a bit of my own personal experience because I am exactly what you said about the insulin response. We're trying to avoid those moderate insulin responses in between your meals. And that's why we're avoiding the creamers and all of that. Then it would seem like it would be okay, or at least I thought so, to have the black coffee as much as I wanted until I figured out, and this is very individual, guys, so there's no way of knowing until sort of you test it on yourself. N=1, as Coach Larry would say. But I figured out, and I'll explain to you how I figured this out, but I figured out that having, and I love black coffee, I do not need cream in my coffee, but I figured out that after the second or third and sometimes fifth cup of black coffee, because I can just go a little nuts, that I would have obviously an adrenal response. And it was obvious because what ended up happening with me is that I would have what's called rebound hypoglycemia. So a couple of hours later, I would have this severe drop in blood sugar. So that means that I have an adrenal response, right? Too much of the stress hormones are produced when I have the caffeine. And yes, it is if I have the second or third cup. The first one seems to be okay, but after the second or third or fourth and fifth, that's even worse. What will happen is I'll have a stress response that will create that hyperinsulinemic response, which then will go in and take out too much sugar out of my bloodstream. And then I'll have a drop in blood sugar. So within a couple of hours, I'm shaking. And that rebound hypoglycemia does not feel good. So no one has to tell you that you're feeling it. Believe me, if that happens to you, you will know, you will feel it. And then you go into this hypoglycemic state where you're in search of sugar. So having too much black coffee does not work for me, and it may not work for you. But if it does, and if you don't have an insulin response, then you should be fine. If you do have an insulin response, you will feel it, guys. Don't worry too much about it. It is very obvious when I have it. I feel it. I'm shaking. I need something within a couple of hours, whereas I can go hours and hours between meals without a problem otherwise.
Thanks, Nadia. Reactive hypoglycemia is so common. I really appreciate you chatting about it. And if you're someone who's listening, you haven't been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, reactive hypoglycemia is one of the first signs that you need to start doing something today.
That's what happened with me.
Yeah.
So way before I became pre-diabetic or diabetic, I had these bouts of reactive hypoglycemia. And so it actually, I thought that meant I had to have more sugar. And of course, that was adding fuel to that fire. So that's so true, Megan.
Alrighty, Nadia, we've got a question for you. We get lots of these questions about women and fasting. Nadia is the guru here. And this question is about fasting and a woman's cycle. During the week before menstruation, should I not fast at all? I would love a guide that gives a general idea of what type of fasting is recommended related to where a woman is within her cycle and keeping our hormones in mind.
Thanks, Megan. That is a great question. It's a common question. It's one that, because we realize that people have so many questions about this, particularly because there's so much contradictory and conflicting information out there about fasting in women and their hormones. And here's my biggest concern. And I share this all the time, Megan, with our community and even in my social media. When women hear too much contradictory, conflicting information, they feel very paralyzed, like they do not know what to do. And that's why I think it's so important that we address these questions. Not to toot our own horn, but we are the experts. We're the people that have been fasting women for years and years and years, women of all ages, both in clinic and online. So we do have a lot of experience, and we do realize that at some points in your cycle, fasting is harder. If you're going through a particular health concern, fasting is not recommended if you're changing medication. So I do think that we've had enough experience to feel pretty confident about our recommendations. So you're hearing a lot of conflicting info about fasting and your hormones, but often that information is coming from people who have never fasted in their lives or never fasted a woman in their lives. And so if you do feel pretty paralyzed or confused, let us know and we will try to help as much as we can. Come into our community and hear what these women that have a lot of experience with fasting themselves say. I think that this makes us feel so much better, and that's why our community has had such a great impact on even my own personal experience. It's really nice to hear confirmation over and over again from women in their reproductive years, postmenopausal women. So for this reason, actually, Megan and I have created a Women in Fasting series on Mondays. So within our community, I do a weekly presentation every Monday on various women in fasting topics. This is one topic that I talk about very, very often, fasting for your menstrual cycle. So the big difference here, and of course, if you're wondering, it's because you're in your reproductive years. That means you still have a period and you may or may not be trying to conceive. So the biggest factor here is going to be, of course, first and foremost, we're going to assume you have a period and not postmenopausal. And the second factor is going to be whether you're trying to conceive or not. If you are a woman trying to conceive and fasting for healing in order to improve your reproductive health, then what you want to do is you want to keep your longer fasts to the first half of your cycle. So once you get a period, between the first day of your period and about midway through your cycle, which is when you hopefully are ovulating, between the first day of your period and your ovulation, it is safe and easier to fast. So you can do some longer healing therapeutic fast during that time of your cycle. If you are trying to conceive, then likely you're tracking your ovulation. Post-ovulation, you do not want to fast. It is not recommended that you fast. You want to stick to whatever dietary recommendation you are comfortable with. There are some great experts out there that have some great recommendations for how to eat during pregnancy. So if you're trying to conceive, consider post-ovulation as if you are already pregnant. You may not know whether you're pregnant or not, so just err on the side of caution. Imagine that you are, and so post-ovulation, you eat for pregnancy. So then that's not us. Then you go to another expert. So then between ovulation and the beginning of your cycle, so if your cycle comes again, then of course you're not pregnant. So then you can and should, if you're fasting for healing, do some longer therapeutic fasts. Now, If you're not trying to conceive, and I think that's what this particular person is asking, then how should you fast post-ovulation? So I'm, again, not trying to conceive. It's not unsafe to fast. You can continue to do your fasting schedule. Let's say you're doing an alternate day fasting for weight loss. You can continue with your alternate day post-ovulation. What happens, as you correctly stated in this question, is that the week before your cycle, it may be very difficult to fast. The reason why that happens is because during your premenstrual week, because of your hormones, progesterone in particular, you are a bit more insulin resistant. And what that means is that you're going to feel things like more craving, more retention, more irritability, and some of the other symptoms that you clearly recognize as being part of PMS. So it is harder to fast, and you may have even some weight gain associated with that. Does that mean that you cannot fast? No, it does not. So if you don't feel any of this and you want to continue on with your alternate day, you certainly can. And the reason why I say this with confidence is because the people that usually come to our program are insulin resistant women that are looking to lose weight, reverse diabetes, reverse PCOS. So their main concern is hyperinsulinemia, is higher than desired insulin levels. And our main objective with fasting is to help to lower that insulin in order to balance out your other hormones, your reproductive hormones. And we learned this from women with PCOS, okay? Another presentation that I love to do and talk about. So if you're insulin resistant, your main objective is to lower insulin. And so you might hear a lot of experts say that you should not and cannot fast post-ovulation because you should be promoting your progesterone production. That is not what you're likely trying to do within our program. That might be something to focus on later. Once you've reversed your insulin resistance, once you've lowered your insulin, you may want to look into doing some healthy carb cycling. I mean, that is a great topic of discussion for later. If your primary focus and your primary concern is insulin resistance, then your primary objective is to lower insulin. So yes, you can continue to fast, but if it's hard to fast, then there are great alternatives. And my personal favorite alternative for that week before your cycle, if fasting is harder, is to fat fast. Now, fat fast is a fast mimicking diet that we often talk about. It's a great, wonderful tool for you to do. A fat fast is a fast mimicking diet because even though you're eating, so you're not fasting, particularly during this week because it's harder to fast, and understandably so, then you're fat fasting instead. It's a fast mimicking diet because you're eating foods that even though they're rich and nourishing and satiating, and there is a very nice balance, adequate balance between fiber, protein, and fat when you're properly fat fasting, even though you're doing that, you're not producing a high amount of insulin. These foods, these particular foods, are very low on the insulin spectrum. So that's my long answer to this, but I have a lot more detail even in my presentation on Mondays when I talk about fasting and menstrual cycles. What have you seen, Megan?
Yeah, the exact same as you. And often, when women who do struggle so much before their cycle with eating, I was one of those women, like I could have eaten cardboard, the hunger is just nutty and the cravings were truly for awful things. But at the end of the day, you'd resort to almost eating anything. That does get better with time. So it can be like pulling teeth during that week of your cycle to saying, okay, this is a little bit challenging, but it's a lot more manageable. And even till today, that week before, my cycle, I am more hungry, but I can definitely control my cravings. So I'm no longer fighting sort of the insulin beast on that level where I want all of the junky food. I now crave like really good, healthy fats, especially. So fat fasting is always an awesome strategy. I'm kind of in that family planning stage right now. So definitely not doing too much fasting after ovulation because, that's a time that I'm hoping that there's growth occurring, and fasting is anti-growth. So I'm following some of those other experts like Lily Nichols right now. But you got to go with the ebbs and flows of it too. A lot of women get down on themselves right before their period too because progesterone's so dominant and it doesn't necessarily make you feel sexy. Whereas at the start of your cycle, estradiol's kind of dominant, or kind of, it is dominant, and that makes you feel good and sexy and on top of the world. And it also suppresses your appetite. So you can go through these ebbs and flows. So just be kind to yourself out there, ladies. this is normal, and it's important to change things up also. That's one thing you hear Nadia and I say all of the time, and just sort of fasting around your cycle can definitely be a great strategy to help you change things up. And the third question for today's session is, I decided to do time-restricted eating for life, and it's working for me, but I don't understand why it's working for me. So time-restricted eating means that you are setting a certain number of hours a day that you allow yourself to eat versus a certain number of hours a day where you're not permitting yourself to eat. So this means that you're isolating your eating window, so you don't end up eating from the moment you wake up to the moment that you go to bed. So why is this so powerful? Like, let's think back to our grandparents and great-grandparents and how they grew up. In that day and age, when my grandparents and great-grandparents grew up, 3 meals a day was the trend. So it's not necessarily like they were doing crazy fasting, but they did time-restricted eating, meaning that they just ate those 3 meals and they didn't eat after dinner, which almost always resulted in these regular 12 to 14 hour fasts, depending on their schedule each and every day. I always ask people that grew up in North America too to think back to that show, Leave It to Beaver. I grew up watching that show, and it was so funny because the beaver, he would always try to sneak a cookie or sneak an apple or something, and his mom, Mrs. Cleaver, she wasn't having any of it. And you would see her on every episode make his lunch. And at most, that kid went to school with an apple, like as a treat. Versus when I grew up, I would go to school with a pail of treats from my mom. So I could eat every minute of every school day. And of course, school had treats too when you were there. So back to Leave It to Beaver. So he had breakfast. He had no snacks for the morning time. He had his lunch. He had no snacks for the afternoon. Every episode, he'd come home from school wanting a treat, and he had to save his appetite for dinner. And every night after dinner, he wanted a treat. And the answer was, you should have eaten more broccoli at dinner. In this day and age, yeah, sure, there was diabetes and there was obesity, but it wasn't the epidemic that it is today. That was the norm for individuals. And what they were doing was practicing time-restricted eating. They had these isolated periods throughout the day where they were eating, and then they had these designated periods a day where they were fasting for a substantial number of hours. And there's so much data to support all of the great health benefits that come along with, say, reducing risks of metabolic-related cancers, for just doing regular daily 14-hour fasts. So why does this work? Well, every time we eat, we do have a bit of an insulin response. That means even if you're eating cheese or almonds or olives, you're going to be having a bit of an insulin response. So, or insulin's not necessarily always produced in response to eating processed and refined sugars, a ton of starch, processed and refined fats. And one thing that often gets so overlooked is that we develop metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, from also the chronic stimulus of insulin. So there are 2 main pathways through developing insulin resistance. One, through producing high volume of insulin in response to the food. So this is where the processed and refined sugars and fats, and consuming a ton of starch, like that half a plate of potatoes instead of that like fifth of a plate of potatoes, can be problematic. And in today's day and age, they're telling us to eat like that and eat all of the time, which is why we're seeing such a huge epidemic of type 2 diabetes and obesity. But something that Nadia and I see all of the time in the community is, I've been doing ketogenic diets for this long, which is a really low carbohydrate diet, or I've been doing low carb for this number of years. Why am I only losing 50 of that 80 pounds? Why can't I lose that last 30 pounds? Why was I able to bring my A1C down to 6? Why can't I bring it under 5.2? Why can't I optimize my health? Am I just too broken? And the answer is always in the frequency of their meals. Sure, they're no longer eating the processed and refined garbage, and they've cut back their consumption of starchy foods, but they're eating from the time they wake up to the time they go to bed. They're starting off with that bulletproof coffee coffee in the morning, some almonds, they're having some cheese in the afternoon in between their meals. They're literally eating for the entire day, and they're not getting in that 12, 14-hour fast that our grandparents and great-grandparents got in overnight. And they sure as heck aren't isolating their eating throughout the time that they're awake either. And this chronic stimulus of insulin can be enough to lead to the development of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. This is why fasting is just so powerful. If you're someone out there with insulin resistance already, you're not going to get all the way by restricting your carbs so much and by following a ketogenic diet. You need to minimize the number of times a day your body's secreting insulin. There's 2 pathways to insulin resistance. So for this individual who's asking, why is the time restricted eating? Why is isolating to just, 2 meals a day or 3 meals a day or occasionally 1 meal a day? Why is that working? Well, it's working for you because you're minimizing the number of times a day that you are secreting insulin. We often make lots of jokes about funny metaphors to help people understand what insulin resistance is. And my husband, when I met him, he was living in San Francisco. I was living in Toronto, and that was our first year of marriage. And everybody, like all of these, my great aunts and my mom and her cousins, her first cousins, they all said, you wait, till you live together. You guys are all so lovey-dovey right now because we only saw each other intermittently. We were fortunate. We saw each other about every 2 weeks that first year of marriage. And it was always rainbows and butterflies. And then about 3 months after he moved to Toronto and we actually lived together, I was ready to kill him. And he was ready to kill me. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. I think anybody who's been in a relationship can relate to that. And it's the same thing. Absence of insulin makes our cells and our insulin receptors grow fonder of that insulin. So if you're constantly showing that insulin receptor love and affection from secreting insulin, there's going to be conflict. So having these periodic breaks from producing it is really beneficial in enabling that healing. So just like in your relationship, you want you to have time, you want your partner to have time, you want to have time, together. You need to find that balance to have a healthy relationship. It's the same thing with your meal frequency, because overexposure always leads to problems.
I don't know if I even want to comment on that, Megan, considering how long I've been married. And we all know how challenging this pandemic was for many, many couples, being in the same house all the time, not just couples, but being with your kids all the time, every second of the day. So anyway, I'm just going to leave that one and get to our next question, which is a great question. And we have some great resources on this. But is resistance training in a fasted state, specifically longer fasts of 72 hours, a waste of time when there is no intake of protein before and after sessions to trigger muscle protein synthesis? Well, resistance training is never a waste of time, and particularly not a waste of time in a fasted state. So what happens, of course, and as I was saying, we do have some amazing resources on this. So those of you that want the science, I often refer back to our old blog posts that Megan and Dr. Fung have written over the years. So if you go to blog.thefastingmethod.com and you do a search on exercise and fasting, you're going to get some great resources and articles on this. But what you will learn, the science behind this, is that when we are in a fasted state, our body produces some counter-regulatory hormones, including growth hormone. And so while you're fasting, and it actually, if I'm not mistaken, it peaks as you continue to fast. And so you actually do have benefit in exercising, even in some of these longer fasting periods, because I believe it peaks at around 72 hours, if I'm not mistaken. It goes up to a certain point at about 36 hours. You have a really nice amount of growth hormone. And then I believe that it peaks at around 72 hours. But I'm going to ask Megan more on this in just a little bit. So what this means is that while you're fasting, you're actually giving your body this opportunity, among other things, in healing, to create more of this growth hormone. So then when you go and eat afterwards and eat appropriately, and of course you want to focus on protein appropriate amounts of protein after, then you are going to build more muscle. So you have the building blocks. You have these two essential building blocks. You have this hormone and you have the protein then to help you build more. And so I actually don't think it's a waste of time. And more importantly, our experience, our clients, our community members, especially those that have the opportunity to check their body composition over time. And I have had the opportunity to look at many DEXA scans. So these are scans that people do to look at their body composition, their body fat percentage versus their lean mass percentage. Some of us, myself included, do have some of these body composition skills at home, and some of these are quite accurate because we've compared them to these DEXA scans, and we can see that even though we're fasting and we're burning fat, if we're doing the resistance training with it, we're actually building a lot more muscle as well, even while fasting. So Megan, I'm going to throw this over to you because I do, and I think some people do want to hear more of the science, more of the specific science about why this is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had my best weight training session like ever at 94 hours fasted. And the trainers at the gym used to think I was nuts. And then they saw how awesome that I did. And I told them I was fasting. And they invited me to come in and talk to them about fasting because they were just so amazed. And I've been struggling with it quite a bit. At that time, I had some mold illness. So I just buckled down and did a longer fast. And gosh, it paid off in spades. But yeah, so I think Nadia's done a really great job going over sort of the counter-regulatory hormones and lean mass. And we see individuals gain lean mass all the time, as Nadia stated. And it's important to remember, too, that when we have weight to lose, we do have excess protein hanging around. So all of that body fat that you have is largely supported by connective tissue. And when we lose the body fat, then we've just got connective tissue. And connective tissue costs a lot of metabolic money to maintain. You know, it's kind of like paying for an office building during COVID lockdown and you're not allowed to go into the office space. I'm sure so many business owners can relate, or people that work for companies are paying a fortune for this office space that you can't even use. So just like we saw with COVID, you know, so many people abandoning their leases on this corporate rental space. Our body does something similar when we're fasting. So we've got this expensive connective tissue. And when we're in a fasted state, our bodies experience this physiological phenomenon called autophagy, the cellular recycling, where old and damaged cells and proteins are broken apart, and new ones are put together. But we also see the body make some rational decisions too. So you're in a fasted state and your body sees that you're paying for this connective tissue you're no longer using. Well, autophagy can actually target that connective tissue. And from that connective tissue, you're going to have protein essentially made available to your body for things like muscle synthesis, protein synthesis. So you can grow quite a bit too. So, you know, we always talk about how growth doesn't necessarily always happen around the fast. But when you do have that weight to lose, you do have that excess protein that your body is going to be making available for itself during the fast. So you're likely to trigger most of that growth with sort of the perfect cocktail that Nadia described: the increased human growth hormone during the fast, the protein from the meal, the insulin from that meal. There is some protein that is still being generated during these longer fasts. So never discourage anybody from doing any type of resistance or weight training during these fasts if they do have that weight to lose and they're feeling good during their fast. Often for me, I found throughout my journey that doing those types of exercises made me feel very good during my fast. And I did see quite a very favorable shift in my body composition and was able to gain quite a bit of lean mass. We see this all of the time from all of the members who do their DEXA scans, and, you know, they're losing weight and they're often interjecting some of these longer bursts of fast, like 72 hours into the routine, and it's only helping them. So our bodies are quite smart. And if we've got this excess weight to lose, we do have some excess protein. So you're even getting some protein while you're fasting without even consuming it if you have this excess weight. So if you feel good, keep it up. Hydration hydration is critically important. Can't recommend The Salt Fix or the book Wind, both by Dr. James DiNicolantonio. Siim Land helped co-author the book Wind. Really great info in there about hydration around exercise, especially if you're in a fasted state. I'd say they're both Bibles that people should have if they are going to be doing training in a fasted state, like 72 hours. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for today's Q&A episode. We want to let you know that we have a special series of masterclasses that are available. It's with our amazing psychologist, Dr. TRE Lance. She's going to be tackling all of the things that are really the roadblocks for fasting becoming sustainable in your lifestyle. Things like self-sabotage, sugar addiction, limiting beliefs. This course, it's a 2-week course where she's going to guide you all through the science and the strategies. And then in May, Nadia, Dr. Pataguana here, will be leading a Woman in Fasting Masterclass. And in June, I'll be doing a special summer weight loss bootcamp one. They're all 2 weeks long, and you can learn more about them over on our website, thefastingmethod.com, and check them out. And again, if you've got questions, let us know. Email them in to podcast@thefastingmethod.com. Bye for now, everyone.
Bye, everyone.